Welcome to this week's industry news episode. The idea of this episode is that I'll review interesting links that I found throughout the week so that you can check them out too. Alright, so let's dive in. Probably the biggest issue in the last week for me was that Docker Hub had a security breach. You can find the links to all these sites in the episode notes below. If you read through here, you'll find that about 190,000 people had their usernames, their hashed passwords, and a subset of people had their GitHub and Bitbucket tokens for their auto builds exposed. I was one of the people that received an email, so I guess my data was exposed too. I'd highly recommend that anyone who has a Docker Hub password change it, just to be safe. There was also a pretty good Hacker News thread where they chat through some of the auto build stuff if you're interested in that, just some of the steps that you can take. But for me, when I checked Docker Hub, I did have my GitHub account linked, so I disconnected that. This used to say connected here. Then I checked on the GitHub side too, and there was no Docker Hub tokens kicking around. You can check for linked accounts by logging into GitHub, going to the settings, and then the applications tab. So you can see nothing exists for Docker Hub here. The thing is, I never even had any Docker Hub auto builds configured. I just had this kicking around from a long time ago, so I should have been more proactive and disabled it when I was done testing. There's a GitHub page for reviewing the security log, but the issue is that it only records the last 50 actions on your account. When I looked through the security log, I didn't see anything of concern, but I also don't have any private repos hosted up on GitHub, so I'm not too worried about it. But again, I'd recommend changing your password, checking if you have any tokens, and then checking your GitHub activity feed. This is just sort of a reminder that this type of stuff is pretty much why all enterprise customers require an on-prem hosted version of, say, GitHub and a totally private Docker registry, as these things don't happen very often, but when they do, it can be highly concerning. All right, so that's it for the bad news. Let's move on to some cool stuff. So next up, the folks over at Shopify posted something interesting around how they're deploying Istio for their service mesh, but they ran into a major problem, and that's cost. So the article is pretty good, and it walks you through a bunch of metrics and performance profiling they did. They mentioned that for every million requests per second they see, when running a service mesh like Istio with detailed telemetry enabled, Istio consumes around 1,200 CPU cores. So you're paying a massive performance cost. I think they're still in the pre-production phases here and they're just testing the waters, but by their calculations, they estimate that running something like Istio could end up costing them an extra $40,000 to $50,000 per month just to run this proxy service. I found it a pretty interesting read. It sort of echoes my previous comments back in episode 63 when we looked at Istio, about how it's still super early days, and I wouldn't recommend deploying it into production. There's likely much more performance improvements coming down the pipe, along with a lot of best practices that still need to be fleshed out. But it's nice to see a big company like this is testing the waters and sort of learning these lessons for you. So hopefully it's just going to get better. The final article that I wanted to share was around this pretty good command line debug session, where it was discovered that disabling colors when listing a directory with lots of files greatly speeds things up. I'll let you read through it yourself. It's a pretty quick read, but the thing I like about this article is they walk through it step by step, providing metrics and a before and after. And personally, I didn't know that you paid such a performance penalty when you have colors enabled, when you're listing a directory with lots of files. All right, so that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you find some of this interesting. I'll see you next week. Bye.